about you, but I grew up going to museums. From the humble seaside shack in my hometown that just had some old harbor rope and the mayor's shoes in a glass case, to the Royal Ontario Museum, where I would spend hours deciphering hieroglyphics and counting the bird species of the Galapagos. Leaving Anishinaabe territory to settle west on Lekwungen and Wasanich territory, I quickly checked the Royal BC Museum off of the tourist top 10 list. I, like many tourists and locals alike, was mesmerized by the romantic immersion into the Becoming BC gallery, specifically the Old Town exhibit, which is a recreation of a late 19th century town in BC, complete with train station, storefronts, a pharmacy, and even a theater, always playing black and white films. The gallery also has a replica of the Discovery ship that originally brought explorers to these lands. Its name aptly referencing the idea that Europeans were indeed discovering new uninhabited land. I was impressed by the interactive living languages exhibit, in which patrons can explore audio recordings of different Indigenous dialects throughout the Pacific Northwest. The entrance to the third floor human history exhibit actually consists of a series of Indigenous displays, including a pit house, totem poles, a Kwakiwak big house, carvings, and a Nishka community scene. The museum is actually filled with many Indigenous cultural artifacts, like totem poles, masks, clothing, carvings, tools. It's pretty cool, right? Right? After walking through the Indigenous history section, you enter into the modern history gallery. See, the interesting thing about traditional museums is that they necessarily set up a chronology of events, a linear timeline that is history with a capital H. In doing this, they tell a story that is assumedly supposed to capture the experiences and constructions of a certain place, people, or events. By putting the Modern History Gallery, which houses Old Town and the HMS Discovery ship alongside other settlement era displays, after the Indigenous exhibit, and calling the entire gallery Becoming BC, the museum tells us that BC was once peopled by primitive First Nations, but then it was colonized. And that brought us into the modern era where there are no more First Nations, right? It's ridiculously offensive that this needs to be clarified, but First Nations do very much still exist. The Royal BC Museum isn't the only museum that advances this specific history, but this should prompt us to ask how museums can tell stories that account for the multiple overlapping experiences of the people that were and are a continuing part of them. As cultural institutions embedded within the political, social, economic, architectural, and ideological networks of the city and often the nation, can the state-funded museum ever be a place of neutral storytelling? Museums create a pastness, implying that in order to see a history and to tell it, we need to be outside of it, beyond it. There's a sense of escape when we walk through Old Town, because we get to see the beauty of a certain time period without personally having to deal with any of its challenges or realities. For example, for a long time, there was no mention of the Indian residential school system, which was a major tool of colonization in Canada and America. This was until a set of Erstadt's keys that malnourished children at the Cooper Island residential school would use to unlock a cupboard of food were added in the late 2010s. The small Chinatown exhibit within Old Town also was not added until that time as well, despite the major presence and influence of Chinese people in the founding of Victoria and the province as a whole. Neither of these exclusions should be considered outside of the province's long, violent history of anti-Asian hate and Indigenous elimination. In this way, it could be argued that the museum, as a representative of the Crown Corporation, does tell a very accurate story in what it chooses to include and exclude, what to highlight and what to hide. The Royal BC Museum actually found itself in hot waters over the last few years, as calls for repatriation of Indigenous artifacts, exhibit modernization, and internal racism all came to the fore at once and were exacerbated by the conditions of the pandemic. In 2020, Lucy Bell, the Haida head of the museum's Indigenous Collections and Repatriation Department, resigned, publicly citing an internal culture of racism. 7 months later, Tunaha curator of the Indigenous collection, Troy Sebastian, called the museum a wicked place after his contract ended. He wrote on Twitter, "The truth is that the Royal BC Museum is established as a bastion of white supremacy, whose Indigenous collections are a gargantuan repository of trauma and violence." After Sebastian's departure, museum CEO Jack Lohman resigned and was replaced by acting CEO Daniel Musica, who quickly backed the release of a 30-page report condemning the museum as a product of systemic racism that was both, quote, a racist, anti-Indigenous, and colonial place, as well as a sexist and psychologically unsafe space for women. Attached to the report was a public service agency investigation into the allegations. The public service agency investigation was highly influenced by Bell's resignation speech, in which she contended that the museum needs to become a safer and more welcoming place for Indigenous people and other people of color, especially considering its anthropological legacy and storytelling capacity. The report and staff audit confirmed that the museum fostered an environment of anti-Indigenous racism, sexism, and discrimination. Leadership failed to intervene in that discriminatory culture. The museum did not move quickly or meaningfully to align its practices, policies, and structure with the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. There was inadequate resourcing and prioritizing of equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility principles. The human history exhibits were outdated and narrowly privileged a European viewpoint rather than transparent colonial realities. Many staff felt the museum was a toxic workplace characterized by a culture of fear and distrust, and the institution did not have the adequate resources to meet the requirements of the Museums Act. The CEO closed out the report, admitting that, quote, over the years, our organization has made people feel unwanted, disrespected, and unheard. A number of First Nations leaders responded to the report. Terry Tagee, a Dekel, Gitxsan, and Sekani regional chief with the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations, said, quote, it's disappointing, concerning, and disturbing in terms of how First Nations are looked upon within the museum. The First Nations Leadership Council also expressed disconcernment over the findings of systemic racism. The report may have gone unnoticed or unnoted by the greater Victoria public, who don't need to concern themselves with Indigenous issues lest out of special interest. But in November of 2021, locals were shocked to learn that they would also wear the consequences of the museum's colonial behavior. The CEO announced that the Royal BC Museum intended to turn the page on their shameful legacy by decanting their human history exhibit in an effort to decolonize. God, speak English, Daniel. This came as a surprise, despite Premier John Horgan announcing in his 2019 speech from the throne 2 years earlier that modernization of the museum would be a priority during his term in office, touting it as a necessary step in the application of UNDRIP to the province as mandated by the DRIPA passed earlier that year. Following the reconstruction announcement, Horgan explained the Crown Corporation's decision, saying, quote, for decades, the stories told at the Royal BC Museum have failed to accurately reflect our colonial history or include everyone. That's why today we are making this historic investment to build a safer, more inclusive, and accessible modern building. The new museum will be a flagship destination for tourism and a place where generations will come to learn about the richness and diversity of BC's history. Our ears shouldn't gloss over the second part of this statement, where Horgan contains the potentially transformative overhaul within the language of liberal multiculturalism. Wherefore the province can become the proud owner of all the stories within its colonial bounds, if only it attests honestly to a shameful past. Language that seeks to capture and neutralize the inherently radically transformative imperatives of decolonization as a sweeping, multi-scalar project must not be read as benevolence or humility because it's plainly self-defense. It's self-defense in a settler colonial context where the land question has not been settled, especially in BC where there is a grand overall lack of historical treaties and a great contestation over consensus ad idem, or the meeting of minds, where there are historical treaties. So in order to avoid the true question of sovereignty, The land question is rhetorically manipulated into the Indian problem, where the issue to be dealt with is Indigenous brokenness, whether that be intergenerational trauma, criminogenic inclinations, low educational attainment, high suicide rates, negative health statistics, parental incapability, band council corruption, deviance from Western sexual and gender norms, governance incapacity, poor housing and reserve conditions, urban homelessness, or the disappearance of Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirits. In a twisted way, then, the settler state maintains a benevolent, paternalistic role above Indigenous communities that it stories as inherently damaged and broken, while that damage itself is the result of that same historical and ongoing colonial governance. I'm just going to pause to apologize for my finger. Because God forbid everything isn't aesthetically pleasing when we're talking about colonization. So the revamp announcement sparked an outpouring of public disaffection, exacerbated by reporters and opposition members who focused on the project's hefty price tag, because it also included like a literal destruction of the building because it's too old and is like a threat to the collections within it, and is filled with asbestos. Anyways, they argued that the money could be better spent elsewhere, although it was also only 1% of the budget. Many journalists chose to highlight and recycle the concession that the exhibits deserved a conservative degree of updating, i.e. adding BIPOC histories to the rightly white main history. But the wanton, whole-scale destruction of a beloved installment like Old Town was simply blind, reactive, political pandering to woke culture. This popular view, shared by many commenters, expresses an emerging form of patriotism in Canada, where the hypervisibility of Indigenous politics created by the state's attempts to neutralize sovereignty threats through overcompensatory recognition politics seems to have thoroughly motivated a sense of disaffection, as our prideful Canadian image is revoked, empowering settler denial of colonialism as a structure in favor of a past event that has surely been atoned for following a couple decades of residential school apologies, inquiries, and promises. The disgruntled public concedes that everyone's stories should be told on their own terms, in theory, but in practice, if that comes to threaten how we know and understand ourselves as settlers, if that means that we need to rewrite the whole story rather than just add colorful side exhibits to the main story, if that means giving up any degree of space or sense of belonging, the conversation of dispossession and consent is suddenly very important. Popular journalism also strategically highlighted Indigenous voices speaking out against the project to paint the idea that even those in whose name the revamp was being conducted didn't support it, because all Indigenous people have the same opinions and interests, right? Journalist Tristan Hopper pointed to the findings from a series of engagement sessions with First Nations in September 2019 to highlight that rather than recommending a complete rebuild of the human history exhibits, First Nations, quote, mainly wanted a place where their names would be spelled correctly, where their cultural items would be displayed with respect, and where their history would be represented as dynamically as it was for other white British Columbians. Aside from greatly reducing and diluting the input of those participating First Nations representatives, Hopper also misrepresented these recommendations as being made in regards to the human history exhibits, when they were actually only aimed at the Indigenous collections that the participants toured. There was no mention of dismantling or even fixing the other galleries in the report because they weren't a subject of discussion. That doesn't mean that its decolonization is not also necessary and supported by First Nations. It means that the focus of their visit was on their cultural items. In reality, while Hopper's summary of the Indigenous Voices report paints a reformative approach to modernization of the museum, participants did detail a thorough systemic transformation. Nevertheless, mass negative opinion ultimately led Horgan to cancel the project altogether. And the new plan is to assuage public anxieties by consulting on ways to modernize the human history exhibit together. Despite the challenges and changes to the project, it's important to understand the motivations that made it a political priority in the first place. Do we accept this as the story of proactive institutional response to its aired flaws, as governmental moves to implement decolonial policies such as the Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, DRIPA, or was this pressured change perhaps the inevitable effect of a much longer journey? It's important to ask what purpose museums, as state-funded institutions, actually serve. As holders of historical archives and sites of accumulated and curated anthropological and environmental research, museums are supposed to be trusted bastions of the objective, singularly all-encompassing truth that is history. In this way, museums are entrusted with mapping authority when it comes to our stories and how we know ourselves and each other. The question is, whose stories do they tell? Is it possible for curators to make story-building decisions that aren't influenced by their own worldviews? Is someone even able to tell someone else's story purely through observation? And what are the potential consequences to this dominant museological presumption? The findings of outdated, i.e. offensively exclusionary, exhibits in the Royal BC Museum indicate that there might be. In a Yellowhead Institute brief, Aziza Kanji explains how the overwriting of Indigenous histories and geographies is a settler colonial method of erasing Indigenous sovereignty by rewriting the past in a way that frames colonization as inevitable and therefore justifies an ongoing colonial regime that it calls multicultural liberal democracy. The late prolific Stolo matriarch Lee Miracle describes this rewriting as a forceful remapping of the sociological and topographical landscape. The purpose of this remapping is to erase Indigenous past and presence and consequently naturalize the settler colonial present as a simple nation state, far removed from any potentially unjust foundations or practices that it's willing to admit to. We can see that the Royal BC Museum's human history chronology from a primitive anthropological Indigenous past to a natural sociological settler present actually serves to remap the territories and establish colonial boundaries of social interaction. These colonial boundaries of social interaction that Miracle refers to aren't only speaking to the relationships between Indigenous people and settlers, but also with newcomers. There are many different reasons why newcomers come to so-called Canada, but it can often be with the intent of seeking refuge from situations of colonialism, imperialism, or exploitation, which the Canadian state itself likely played a part in creating. It's too simplistic to wash away that complexity and label all newcomers as colonizers or settlers. When they come to Canada, their belonging is conditional on the disavowal of their maps for the white streaming Western, and their subscription and submission to a story of Canadian multicultural pride. We might ask how these complex identities and their interactions are mapped through stories in the museum. At the RBCM, they simply aren't. The Becoming BC Gallery tells a predominantly white nation-building story of frontier discovery and subsequent taming, and the only entry point for non-white inclusion is in that story, not in incorporation into treaty relations or any resistant solidarities with Indigenous people. Newcomer Indigenous solidarity potentials speaks to settler colonialism's intimate interconnections with other systems of oppression, such as xenophobia, imperialism, cis-heteropatriarchy, and environmental racism. However, at the same time as connections might be found between Indigenous and newcomer visions of liberation, we also cannot equivocate their distinct experiences in a way that waters down Indigenous sovereignty and obfuscates the complicity, privileges, and responsibilities that fall upon anyone settling on unceded Indigenous territories. The absence of newcomer stories in museums maintains white settler privilege, and their calculated inclusion into nation-building narratives further naturalizes and concretizes the settler state by erasing the ways that newcomers work to build good relations through acknowledged similarities, solidarities, and responsibilities. If Canada relies so heavily on the reputational imagery of a multicultural mosaic, how can the Royal BC Museum and the Canadian Museum more generally, accurately, and fulsomely honor these complex relationships? Meraki argues that decentering whiteness in arts and cultural institutions is an urgent matter. are rich histories of Indigenous activism against museums in Canada, whose traditional construction as a French and British settler nation is challenged both by unerasable Indigenous presence and by the growth of diasporic communities. Tracking only one of these through lines of resistance, we can look at the Lubicon Lake First Nations boycott of the Spirit Sings Artistic Traditions of Canada's First Peoples exhibition set to open at the Glenbow Museum in Calgary in 1987. They were doing it to draw attention to the exhibition sponsor Shell Oil Canada Limited, which was drilling on their territories without consent. Although land defense was Lubicon Lake's primary motivation, this became a watershed moment for Indigenous protests against museum representations, the inappropriate handling and display of cultural materials, and the retention of human remains and living cultural artifacts. Although drawing a lot of attention and prompting a shift in museum discourse in Canada, the Spirit Sings boycott was just one instance in a long history of Indigenous resistance to Canadian museology. The Indians of Canada Pavilion at Expo 67 also fueled advocacy for repatriation and self-determination. Even as early as 1797, Indigenous people were adamantly resisting museum anthropologists' desecration of burial grounds. Resulting from the commitment of Indigenous artists, elders, diplomats, researchers, and collections managers, repatriation has gained even greater traction in the decades since Spirit Sings, where the concept is now recognized in the mainstream and occupies the forefront of critical museum discourse. The Royal BC Museum's Indigenous Repatriation Handbook, co-authored by Lucy Bell, Jisgain Haida Collison, who's also Haida, and Luann Neal, who's Kokwakiwak, offers guidance to communities pursuing the healing repatriation of their belongings and cultural heritage. When the CEO of a colonial museum says that decolonization is long overdue, they aren't sourcing time of change insight in the residential school unmarked grave discoveries, or in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or any policies for implementation. And they aren't sourcing it in the multiple inquiries proving ongoing colonial violence. They're referring to a foundational lateness. It's an attempt to manage a dooming flaw in the very ideology and purpose of museums, that they were born as the cultural arm of the colonial state, offering a celebratorily performative physical space to justify and restory the dispossession, theft, and detention of Indigenous cultural property and all the social, legal, governance, relational, and epistemological systems embedded within them. It's an admittance that perhaps the seizure of half their collections from First Nations during a period where their ceremonial usage was forbidden by law was a bit fucked up, in hindsight. The Repatriation Handbook acknowledges that artifacts, were purchased under conditions of duress following the impoverishment of colonization. These cultural belongings were either stored away in the province's archives or put on display in the museum for the purpose of depicting extinct or else vanishing societies and cultures. Troy Sebastian put it succinctly when he said, "In the museum's permanent gallery, Indigenous peoples are a people without history, without future, and a people without land or law." Ultimately, the Colonial Museum might just be fucked. The stories it's tasked with sharing aren't only complex, as the CEO claims, but they reach to the heart of the museum and contest its epistemological foundations. Although radical to a settler public, the Royal BC Museum's vision of reconstructing the museum with actual input from Indigenous and newcomer communities still arguably falls short of decolonization, because it still seeks to contain Indigenous stories within a crown institution that is inherently always trying to collectivize the distinct polities it oppresses within its own body, under its sovereign authority. Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Beta-Samasake Simpson explains that Indigenous people must refuse the ways that the settler state tries to render them legible, and consequently commodifiable and controllable, because its intentions as an illegal occupier will never be pure. Simple inclusion policies offer social capital for the institutions that perform their progressive language, without actually requiring fundamental transformations and reorientations. A strategy of inclusion in the museum allows it to maintain its status quo and underlying assumption of necessary narrative authority. It might even centralize narratives in a damaging way by storying Indigenous resistance within a mainstream site of public education, disconnecting it from its territorial roots and likely minimizing or erasing the irreducible sovereignty enshrined in expressions of Indigenous self-determination. At the end of the day, whether museum decolonization is doable or even desirable is up for debate. I personally would argue no to both, but you can have your own opinion. Ultimately, what the museum decides to do or not do doesn't have any influence on everyday Indigenous reclamation of belonging in place, which occurs with or without settler attention and recording. Regardless of representations and misrepresentations in colonial institutions, a community's story is always housed within their bodies, their elders, their youth, their reserve and diaspora, their teachings, their relationships, their lands, waters, and skies. At the end of the day, I want to give space to those stories, not a colonial institution, on an alleged redemption arc or not. But I also hope what we're all taking away from this video is that we must always be critical of redemptive language and redemptive moves within a settler colonial context.